Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, which is wrapped in all manner of turbulence, political, geopolitical, climatic, which is a mixture of climate change and climate vulnerability, as I've been saying for a long time. And you can go on and on. And now, after the election, we're dealing with some enormous rumblings and preparations in the United States for what the new administration, the incoming administration, is calling mass deportation. Donald Trump has said on pretty clearly that he is, as this was just a day or two ago, true that we're going to declare a national emergency and use military assets to reverse the Biden invasion through a mass deportation program. And every sign is this is not a drill. And at the same time, there's enormous stresses on the ground in a lot of cities, including progressive cities. I just as after I posted this morning, last night, some friends who live in New York City, like on the Upper East Side, are saying, yeah, the crime is out of control, and the migrant issues are huge. And there was just this mass stabbing in New York City yesterday. I'm not sure if they've determined his immigration status. So let's see, and I just want to see if Paolo is here. Paolo, can you hear me?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, good. Okay. So I'm here with two.
Okay, so I'm talking just from the mobile, but yeah, that's all I can do. Sorry about that.
That's okay. It's better than nothing. So today's discussion is about this issue of crime, migration, politics. I'll go back to the opening slide. And I'm really pleased to pull together a couple of people who dig deeply on this and are very focused on the data and on the distortions that are happening as well. And the hope in Sustain What, this project that I do, is to cut through some of the turbulence and confusion and try to see where data can matter and what we do. We're in a time where the world is in motion. There are people moving around the world at unprecedented rates, and that's coming with lots of challenges. So my two guests today are David Beer at the Cato Institute, who is the chief immigration researcher there. It's great to have you on. Are you in the DC area? Where do you live?
Yeah, I'm in DC.
Okay. In this virtual world, everyone can kind of be everywhere. And Paolo Pinotti is at Boccellini University. Did I get? Oh no,
Bocconi.
Bocconi or Boccini? Bocconi, right? University in Milan, and has just done. Both of you have just done detailed analyses of data on crime, migration, and Paolo's is multinational, and we're going to get at this issue and what we can do about it in the next hour or so. It's just great to have everyone here. I have to show, what we've been through in the information sphere has been pretty insane. Eating dogs and cats, and a Madison Square Garden sort of a hate fest was really troubling for anyone who, whether you have migrant background or not. And as I said a minute ago, Donald Trump did reflect very clearly on his favorite platform that we're heading into late January. There's likely to be a national emergency declared in the United States. I've written about why it was not a good idea for Biden to declare a climate emergency. And here's an instance where we may be into another kind of use of that strategy. I wanted to get sort of a quick sense from each of you what drove you to this issue. So, David, why migration? It's tough terrain, and what pulled you there? And tell us a little bit about the Cato Institute's approach, which has been very distinct from other parts of the sort of Republican.
Yeah, I'm a libertarian, so for me, the main issue is human liberty and the opportunity for people to live their lives however they want, as long as they don't harm or injure the rights of other people to do the same. And immigration and really freedom, I would put it under the bucket of freedom of movement in general, is a core part of our existence. The fact that I can move from one state to another and for better opportunity, to be more productive, to live a more interesting and happy life, that's a great thing. And it's also true between countries. The idea of human liberty doesn't end at national borders. The idea that my tax dollars are going to really suppress my rights to associate, contract, and trade with people born in other countries doesn't make me happy. It makes me poor. And I would like to see a lot more respect for human liberty in the immigration space, both for Americans who want to associate with people in other countries, whether as their family members or employees or their employers, whatever the case might be. But that's the core principle for me, is that there should be a presumption in favor of liberty. That doesn't mean anarchy, doesn't mean, people just do whatever they want, regardless of the consequences, but an ordered liberty where you have rules, but they respect the rights of people to live their lives how they want.
Yeah, we'll talk more about that. Several years ago, I did a webcast with folks at Columbia University and elsewhere who were trying to pull together kind of a mobility treaty. It's sort of a prototype for a possible one, with that in mind. I think just what you were describing. So, and I think too often people think about like climate migration as a negative thing, and all kinds of migration. But mobility is different. Fostering mobility is different than that. So that sounds great. And Paolo, again, with your skills as an economist, you could be studying agriculture or all kinds of things. So why migration for you?
I don't know. Personally, I always found topics such as inflation or interest rates a bit boring. So I was interested in migration instead. And when it comes to the economics literature and the academic literature, until a few years ago, you could see like thousands of academic papers about the impact of migration in the labor market, right? But coming from Italy, I saw that this is not really what people had in mind in Italy, right? So I guess in Italy, before than in other countries, there was a lot of discussion about the impact of immigration on crime, right? So this idea that they come for our women, they come for our money. And actually, the prototype of parties in Europe, probably all over the world, was the Northern League first. That was this kind of extreme right-wing party in Italy. And also Berlusconi had a lot of propaganda. He was pushing a lot of propaganda against immigrants. And that was the main reason in Italy, not so much that they steal our jobs, because I guess most people in Italy realize it's not true, right? Because the labor market is very segmented between natives and foreigners. Worker unions, they're pretty powerful and they tend to defend natives against immigrants. So again, 20 years ago, people were not afraid of losing their jobs because of migration, but they were afraid of violent or economic crimes or sexual offenses committed by immigrants. And therefore, what I did was to kind of replicate this economic analysis of the impact of immigration on wages or employment, but replacing the outcome variable, right? So it was no longer in my analysis wages or employment, but it was crime rate, right? And by doing that, I could see that there was really no real impact on crime rates across Italian provinces, across Italian cities. Actually, migrants, they tend to go in cities or in provinces in which there's a booming economy. There's actually a lot of demand for skilled labor and unskilled labor, and therefore crime is not really an issue. As a matter of fact, they go to the north, and we all know that crime is more an issue in southern Italian regions than in northern Italian regions. And then at the same time, I realized that you can't really dismiss all these concerns about immigration and crime, because there's actually one part of the migrant population that is more at risk of committing crimes, and this is the irregular migrants, right? Actually, if you just look at the statistics, if you also do some type of a bit more sophisticated analysis, if you want, you realize that these people actually, they have a disproportionate impact on crime. But then the question is because they are kind of evil to begin with, or is because they are in some condition in which actually the only thing they can do to survive, to get some money, sometimes, not all of them, of course, but some of these people, they may actually be pushed into the criminal sector, right? So, I mean, I don't want to take more time, right? But I just have a couple of more analyses in which we try to assess what happens when illegal immigrants actually receive a legal status. For instance, because there are European Union enlargements that allow some people to enter legally in the country, or because, like many other countries, we attribute, we give out residence permits and working permits using some sort of lottery, right? So something like that happens also in the US. And what we see is that actually when people get these working permits, the probability of committing crime is reduced by a lot.
Yeah. So initially, David, how does that resonate with you? The one thing that I want to note is this is, at least in the United States, it's not a new pattern at all. Even the politics of it, I'm showing here from a discussion I did a couple of months ago. I found this illustration. It was an old cartoon from 1903 from a newspaper, and those are rats. They're actually Italian immigrants depicted as rats, and they have hats that say mafia. And here's Donald Trump in this year, saying it's a poisoning of the blood of our nation. Lots of things resonant there. So David, back to you with another initial thought, and then we're going to get into David's study, and then back to your study, Paolo. Oh, David, you're muted.
The U.S. context is a little bit different than Europe, because our crime rates are so much higher than in Europe to begin with. So we can actually have immigrants who in Europe would be increasing crime rates come here, and they would actually decrease the crime rate. So the U.S. context is somewhat peculiar from that standpoint. It is also true, from what we can tell, that illegal immigrants are more likely than legal immigrants to commit crimes in the United States, but they're both less likely than U.S.-born Americans. So we look at this in a number of different data sets, different ways of looking at this. We can look at the incarcerated population in the United States quite directly through the Census Bureau surveys of people who are incarcerated in the country. So that gives you a pretty good idea of who's committing the most serious crimes that put you in prisons in this country. And you can see that U.S.-born Americans are almost twice as likely as legal immigrants to be incarcerated in the nation's prison. So that's and then for undocumented or illegal immigrants, they're somewhere in between the legal immigrants and the U.S.-born population. And of course, many undocumented immigrants are imprisoned specifically for doing crimes that are related to their illegal immigration to the United States. So that ultimately kind of skews the comparison in some ways. The other thing to note is, we've looked at what happens with large-scale illegal immigration on a regional basis. So what, not just what happens with the crime rate of the illegal immigrant who's coming, but what happens to the cities where they show up. And really the last time we had a big experience with this was in the 1990s and early 2000s. And the relationship is pretty clearly negative, meaning that the crime rate goes down when illegal immigration increases. Now, almost all of that was from Mexico. in the 1990s. Now the context is different. There are other groups arriving in the United States, so we can't make a direct comparison there. But as far as we can tell, yeah, that's a good illustration of kind of what happened with crime rates in the 90s versus what was happening with the immigrant
It's so
population.
interesting.
And you see that the spike there at the end. People have been pointing to that as a reason to be concerned about immigration. The spike started in the second half of 2020 when the border was closed, and by Trump's account, and I would basically agree with it, the amount of immigration, both legal and illegal, were at the lowest levels in a generation. And so we don't see the relationship that we would expect if the sort of the trope about immigration increasing crime were accurate. That doesn't mean there's no problems and that no non-citizens ever commit crimes, but that's not really what we see in the data.
Yeah, and let's back up now to your most recent study, which caught my attention, is the reason we were having this conversation, was looking back at Trump's the transition to Trump and how that in a way, well, maybe you could summarize here. Here's some of the points that are I have a shortcut to your study and some of the key points, but one of the overarching points was that essentially they were trying to go so big with migration policy that they missed the opportunity to zoom in on the people who really were criminals. Is that?
Yeah. And it's really not just Trump. In general, our immigration system is not focused on security and criminals. It's focused on excluding people who don't have the right to come to the United States, which is almost everyone. We only allow about 3% of the people who are applying for visas or green cards this year will actually get them through our legal immigration system. And then that's only the people who even have the opportunity to apply. Many people don't. So the idea that, the main focus of our immigration system is criminals or people who are coming for terrorist reasons is an accurate assessment. But what happened under Trump is he said, we're going to do indiscriminate enforcement. We want to do mass deportation. So we want to arrest the easiest people to arrest. Whoever you come across, it doesn't matter if they're a criminal or not. We want to get them. And that meant that a lot more resources were being diverted into nabbing people who were not criminals, not threats to the United States. And if you look at the data, and this is the sort of the headline of the study that you're talking about, was the fact that under Trump, more people who were convicted of serious offenses in the United States were released than under Biden. And so we hear a lot about the releases, and certainly more total people were released under Biden, but the convicted criminals who were released at a lower rate and in lower numbers under Biden, despite vastly greater numbers of people coming into the United States over the last 4 years.
Wow.
So really the point is he didn't prioritize and focus on the criminals the way he keeps talking about them. He likes to talk about them, but as a justification for going after people who aren't criminals. And that's not in the interest of security of the United States.
Yeah, and Paolo, I'll ask you some questions about how that relates to your findings, not just in the U.S., but in other countries like Chile. But here's a couple more of the highlights from your analysis, David. And, it also, I guess, that broad brush approach also maximizes the pain in a way. You talk about the family separation issue.
Yeah, again, I mean, if your goal is not to stop criminals specifically, then you're going to choose completely different tactics for trying to deter people from coming. If your main goal is just deter the total number of people who are coming in or wanting to stay here and try to get them to leave, you're going to choose shock and awe tactics that aren't focused against people who've committed serious crimes or whatever. And so what the Office of Inspector General found when they looked at family separation were they were prosecuting the parents of kids who were coming here for asylum and not prosecuting people who were sex offenders who had been deported in the past. So real lack of focus on security, despite a lot of the rhetoric of security under the Trump administration.
And that would also seem to cut against yours and Cato's approach to maximizing openness.
Yeah, I mean, look, ultimately, I think all of our law enforcement resources should be targeting people who've proven themselves to be threats to the community. Look, we only solve 50% of our crimes, murders in this country. For other serious violent offenses, it's even lower than that. I would like to see all of our law enforcement resources be targeted to serious criminal activity, including property crimes, shoplifting, all of these types of things where there's an injured person, there's an injured American whose rights were violated, and our system of criminal justice doesn't prioritize those compared to some of these nonviolent offenses. It's a violation of a DHS regulation to cross the border illegally. That's true. But the idea that we should be spending even more money on that than we spend on the FBI and all of these other law enforcement agencies and priorities, that's what we're currently doing. And they want to spend, threefold, fourfold the budget on this, which doesn't make sense from a security perspective at all. If you really want security and safety in your country, you want to go after the people who have proven that they are a threat.
Yeah. And Paulo, some of your analysis was also looking at the United States. David, I think we'll get back to the Texas situation in a minute. Just want to make sure Paulo gets in here too. Paulo is the co-author of of a new paper, Immigration and Crime: An International Perspective, with Olivier Marie. And there's a great piece in the conversation in which they summarize it. Paulo, when you think about some of what David was just describing, what comes to mind in the context of your research?
Yes, so I can confirm that, as David said before, the US are kind of the exception rather than the rule, in the sense that immigrants commit much fewer crimes than natives, than the native-born Americans, while the opposite is true in most other countries, I would say. Probably in all other countries except maybe the UK. So there's some common trait here between the US and the UK, like on many other dimensions. But in most other countries in continental Europe, immigrants, on average, they commit, they have a high probability of committing crimes. At the same time, keep in mind that they are typically less educated, they have lower income than natives. So that's what explains the difference. The most important thing that is that what we try to address is not so much a comparison between natives and immigrants in terms of these crime rates, but actually their impact on the crime rate in the destination cities or regions, which is actually what you care about, right? So you want to know whether immigration really made our country or our cities less safer, as some political propaganda has been telling a lot over the last few years. And this is not true. I mean, what you find consistently across all countries is that carefully executed statistical analysis, they show that an increase in immigration is not associated, is not causing an increase in crime, right? And so there are, I would say, kind of a dozen of academic papers that estimate the impact of immigration on crime in Italy, in the US, in the UK, in Germany, and that's the finding, right, that emerges across all these different countries. So the other thing we did in our last work, in our last paper, was to actually bring many countries together, right? So comparing countries that experience more migration flows or smaller migration flows over the last 10, 20 years, or even regions within countries across Europe, right? And we find consistently the same. I mean, there's no evidence that an increase in immigration causes an increase in the number of crimes that are committed.
Yeah. Sorry. I'm pointing to the example you cite, the work you cite in Chile,
Yeah, absolutely. Chile is another country. The good thing about this study on Chile is that they have perceptions. They also have a measure of perceptions about immigration, right? And they can document this very strong divergence between perceptions and reality, which is another common thing when you study migration, not just in relation to crime. I mean, if you ask to people how many migrants are in a country like Italy, they tend to say, I don't know, half of the population, 40% of the population. In Italy, immigrants are 10% of the population, right? Even when you focus on irregular migrants, which of course they cause greater concerns, and I would say for good reasons, right? Also for the reasons we said before. But nevertheless, even in a country like Italy, they are about 15% of the total migrant population, which are in turn like 10% of the total population in Italy, right? So it's really a very small fraction of the population. And that could be also the reason why, you know, when you look at the impact, you don't see any impact at all.
That's so interesting. And this is where I want to focus for the next few minutes, because David, you know, to some extent, I think you're somewhat of a David and Goliath thing when it comes to the narrative. You know, as a journalist, focus on sustainability questions, whether it's vulnerability to hurricanes or this issue you're describing here. The gap between perception and data is just enormous on all of these things. My friends who are all focused on global warming are blaming global warming way too often for the damage that a hurricane causes. That's just one example of the misperception. So what's your hope when you think about this going forward?
Yeah. So it's interesting that the media is out there searching every day for the next, you know, victim of an immigrant, and to turn this into a big media spectacle. Obviously, greatest compassion in the world for anyone who's a victim of a crime, but the elevation of all of the offenses committed by immigrants, as that's a news story in and of itself as a separate headline, whereas all the other headlines are, you know, someone was murdered, whatever, okay,
right.
Another day in New York. Whereas all of the immigrant crimes get elevated, and if you only see that, then yeah, you're going to have a certain perception. Now it's interesting. The polling on this that I've seen, for the most part, they're not really buying it. I mean, even it's not like a consensus the way that the media narrative is a consensus about it. So there's some more nuance in the public view than in the view of, I guess, the commentary that you see about the subject. So, I mean, yeah, this single case, I mean, that is now a reason to deport everyone in the United States who's here illegally, and go even further and restrict legal entry to people in the future. I mean, it's really gone way too far. Look, you mentioned the Texas study we did on homicide rates in the state of Texas. Texas collects the best data on crimes by immigration status, and so we looked at legal, illegal, native-born over the last decade, and you can see U.S.-born Americans commit most. Not just most of the homicides, but a higher rate of homicides. And the thing you don't get, it's really easy to say, well, if we just excluded all the immigrants, then wouldn't we be safer, because then none of the immigrants would have committed any crimes in the United States. The fallacy there is, if you don't look at the rate, then you'll think, oh yeah, they won't commit any crimes, therefore we'll be safer. But what you should care about is the rate. And if the rate is lower, then your likelihood of being a victim is lower. And there are all kinds of crimes that US-born people are committing against immigrants who would otherwise be committing those same crimes against Americans. And so one example from DC, there was an Afghan interpreter who came here, helped the U.S., came here and was carjacked by some American kid, killed the Afghan guy, stole his car. Well, if the Afghan guy wasn't here, that would have been an American who was the victim of that offense. And so that's why you got to look at the big picture. You can't just look at one incident and say, well, this incident wouldn't have happened if we didn't have any immigration. Well, yes, that specific thing wouldn't have happened, but that doesn't mean that safety would be improved if we just eliminated the immigrant population in the United States. So I think you need to have some nuance when you're talking about this.
Yeah, boy, nuance is hard to come by in the current media environment. I know that in Europe, this is a heated issue in parts of Europe and the UK as well. But I did want to stick with David's point here for another moment. I've been wondering, so how's life in Springfield, Ohio, now that all the rhetoric around eating dogs is over? And I went to Springfield's city website. They have a immigration fact, and there's a line here. It's, what are the questions? They are contributing valuably to jobs that other people are not taking. And here are Haitians creating crime concerns. Haitians are more likely to be the victims of crime than they are to be the perpetrators in our community. Kind of makes your point.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that's the thing that people really overlook. And it's not just in the crime space. It's in the jobs that they're doing. They're doing some of the hardest, most dangerous jobs in the United States. So that's saving lives of Americans who would otherwise be forced to do those jobs. Those jobs still need to get done somehow. And if we cleared out the immigrant population, be Americans who were dying on that bridge doing construction that collapsed in Maryland.
Right.
So, I mean, you can go through all the examples. I mean, the most dangerous jobs immigrants are the most likely to do. And so, we need to think about what they're bringing to this country in a positive way, as well as, be concerned about security. We should have our immigration system focused on that, but that's not what our immigration system is focused on. It's focused on keeping people out as opposed to excluding people who are criminals or threats to this country and allowing people to come in who are not.
And Paolo, I know you can't stay on for the full hour, so I want to get back to you on this too. There's a question I want to ask David in a minute, but I'll get Paolo's reaction here now as well. On the perception gap in Europe generally, are there places that are more data where people are getting it and not freaking out, or is it?
Not that I know. There seems to be something which is intrinsically attracting the attention of people to the issue of immigration more than, the disproportionate weight compared to the real migration numbers, right? Of course, migration is a big issue. It's going to be increasingly the big issue in the next decades. But again, as far as I remember, there's no country in which immigrants, no developed large country, let's say, in which immigrants are more than 15% or 20% of the population. Yeah, of course, it's large and it's probably growing in the next years, but it's not like 50%. So there are a few papers. So there was a paper by Alberto Alesina and Stephanie Stancheva from Harvard, and probably a third co-author that right now I can't remember, but they were conducting survey in 4 very different countries, like the US, but Sweden, Italy, some other country that right now I don't remember. And in all these countries, which are very different, they have very different culture, very different political situations, but nevertheless, there was always this gap between the real number of immigrants and the perceived number of immigrants, the real share of irregular migrants in a country and the perceived share, right? And so the interesting thing is that they also try to conduct some small intervention, right, to align more perceptions with the data. But these things seem hard to change, right? So there's a theory in, I mean, it's not just about economics, it's more about social science in general, about science. I mean, what comes to mind to people? And typically people, they spend way more time and way more attention on exception. So I don't want to say immigrants are the exception, but certainly they're, it's kind of still a small part of the population, but that attracts a disproportionate attention. And what science theory tells you is that you are going to attach a greater weight, a greater probability to this sort of exceptions, right? So what do you think is the share of Irish people with red hair? Just say a number. What do you
Well,
think?
I would 20%.
Yeah, it's like 5%, 6%, something like that. And yours was a very educated guess, right? Because most people would say, yeah, everyone in Ireland is Irish. It's not really that it's like that, but it's just that, I don't know, it's 7, 8% in Ireland, is maybe 1, 2% in Italy, right? So you tend to pay more attention to this thing, which is kind of the salient feature of Irish people. Now, when it comes to migration, you walk around in your neighborhood, you walk around the city center, and you don't notice like the thousands of Americans or the thousands of Italian people that are in a square.
Right.
You focus your attention on people that dress in a different way, that speak in a different way, that, they have a different color or things like that, right? And that's what makes you pay, again, too much attention than you should to migration, right? And of course, then in the second round, there's going to be politicians or other people that have an interest in leveraging this natural tendency that we have as human beings, let's say.
That's so
There's
interesting.
also a bit of a bias in people's observations here in the United States because they know that immigrants tend to live in more urban areas, and urban areas tend to have more crime than rural areas or suburban areas. So there's an automatic connection there. And they don't think about, well, what was there before those immigrants arrived? And it may have been vacant homes. It may have been crack houses, whatever. Like it could have been just a total disaster. But because the urban environment has more crimes occurring in it than somewhere else, there's this association that happens. And it's hard for people to understand these more nuanced reactions that happen. And so when we talk about the effect of immigration on crime, most of the conversation in the US is, well, what is the immigrant crime rate versus the native born crime rate? But that's, like, to Pablo's point, that's not the actual effect of immigration on crime. There are all these other indirect things that happen when new people move into an area that can affect the crime rate. So if I come in, it's now pretty well established that vacant homes and vacant buildings are, for whatever reason, a magnet for crime. This perception of disorder leads to more crimes being committed in those types of environments. So if you have new businesses opening up, cleaner streets, a growing environment, then that can push the crime rate down as opposed to up, even if the immigrants come in are slightly more likely to commit crimes than the existing population. So you need to think about all of the broader dynamics of what happens when people move in to a location, not just the main headline fact that, well, an immigrant committed a crime, therefore we need to keep all immigrants out.
Yeah. So within the sphere of people who have influenced Trump, both earlier and, let's say, Project 2025 Heritage, as distinct from Cato, are you kind of the total outlier in what I, as a sort of progressive liberal, would see as that end of the spectrum of thinking on general economic, social issues? Are you going to be listened to in the next few weeks by people who matter in the incoming administration, or are you locked out?
No, I don't think that I will be listened to. I certainly wasn't listened to last time around. on these issues. I would say, look, there are a lot of people. I mean, Heritage in 2005 were writing very different papers about immigration and the need for visas and the more the benefits of legalization, even. And now, I mean, it's basically like, we shouldn't have any. I mean, the Project 2025's immigration agenda is just closed borders. I mean, it's just not. They want to cancel the legal visa programs. They want to just stop accepting new applicants for legal immigration. I mean, it's not even just mass deportation. It's the full-on agenda of closed borders. And I would say that I'm certainly a minority on the non-left side of things, market-oriented side of things, but there are a lot of people. I mean, the people who studied economics, all come to the same conclusion about the benefit of people, the benefit of workers. The idea that our path to prosperity is through a declining workforce. I mean, it makes no sense to anyone who thinks about it deeply. If that were really the path to prosperity, then, it's first of all an easier thing to accomplish, but you could just get people to stop working. But the real notion that new workers are a threat and we need to be protected from it, it has taken hold among some on the right as a sort of a panacea for problems in our economic system. But I don't buy it, and most people on the right who have studied economics don't buy it either.
Well, hopefully some of this will percolate through. I want to broaden out to the highest level, meaning long time scales and the future of humanity on a mobile planet. Way back this is 2009 on my .earth blog at the New York Times. I was reading the work of Joe Shamy, who's a demographer who used to head the UN Population Division. And, I did this piece, what's the right number of Americans? And he had published this data on that you see here. Here's our population of the country with and without immigration from 1776 through 2009. And it's a fundamentally different America, for sure, obviously. And this, he just now has just done a sort of a new one, updated through the end of this century, carrying us forward from 1776 through past migration, the blue, to future paths. And you can see without migration, that yellow curve doesn't look, as you were saying, doesn't look like a prospering place. It looks like decline. And, robotics and AI can't do the stuff that they can't substitute for that gap, I think. We'll find out, I guess. And Europe, of course, is getting older. Countries like Italy have really low fertility rates, much lower than here. So let's just take this to that wide scale, and maybe each of you could do your best case vision. Start with your worst case vision and your best case vision, how we could get to an America or Europe in 2100 that's feels like it's thriving. And maybe Paolo first, and then back to you, David.
Oh yeah, if I understood correctly your question, this is going to the point. Italy cannot survive without an inflow of immigrants in the next decades, right? So we are, I can't remember, but I think the third or fourth oldest country in the world, right? We have a declining population, native population. So we are, it's aging, and we can keep up with, the workforce that we need just because of migrants, right? So these people pay for our pensions. And let me say, they also provide, in addition to taxes, to fiscal benefits, also a whole range of services that were disappearing in the Italian economy. Think about the services for families, right? So another, not so good feature of the Italian economy is that female labor supply is very low compared to other countries, right? So I did a study about 10 or 15 years ago when I was at the Bank of Italy, in which we found that when migration increased in Italy, female labor supply also increased because migrants, one of the typical occupations is providing services for family, and this released the female labor force and allow women to go out there in the job market, right? So absolutely. I mean, I know the U.S. context much less, but I can say for what concerns Italy, or in the same way, other Southern European countries, the input of migration is going to be essential in the next years. And now I'm really sorry. I need to disconnect as I anticipated.
No, it was great that you could come on, Paolo.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It was great being here. It was so interesting, and thank you again for your work.
Well, and for your work again. Thanks for coming on, and have a good night over there. So worst case and then best case. How do we get there?
Yeah, I mean, the worst case is we just stop immigration. And I mean, even with just sort of the status quo level of legal immigration, the Social Security Administration says that we're going to be about 35 million workers short of what we need to support the Social Security system, revenue compared to expenses. And my worry, of course, is, look, if they just put it all on the credit card and have the Federal Reserve monetize the debt, I mean, that's a path to destruction of our economy. If we just put hundreds of trillions of dollars in unfunded liabilities on the debt with no way to pay for it and no workforce to support these retirees, that would be a cataclysm for our country. And we're not even talking about it. Both parties have just decided that there is no problem here. And, to the extent that you have the Democrats talking about it, they say, well, our policies will be better, but they don't really talk about immigration in particular, which is, a key part of preventing this cataclysm from happening. I really just don't trust that we're going to get Congress to adopt optimal reforms that prevent this from happening. We need people who come in and support this and sort of make it easier to make the correct policies in that area. And like he was saying, when it comes to the needs of an elderly population, we're projected to have over a quarter of our population being elderly, which, right. I mean, you need a tremendous amount of workers to support that population just through healthcare and personal care and home health care. And all of those needs are going to have to be addressed somehow. And right now we do not have the workforce for it, which means we're going to live poorer lives in our older years, our parents' elder years as well. Many families are already going through that. So the optimistic case is, look, we start to understand some of these dynamics better. We get a little bit less politicized about immigration and start focusing on the legal immigration system. And how do we get a legal immigration system that makes sense? So when we tell people, do it the right way, go through the legal process, it doesn't look like an insane maze of bureaucratic regulations, and instead is a realistic prospect for them to get the opportunity to come and work legally in this country and contribute to the greatness of the United States. And so, look, the short term, I don't see any kind of reconciliation or come to Jesus moment, but in the long term, demographics don't lie, and you will end up in a place where a lot of people are going to be saying, well, where are we going to get the workers? Where are these people that are going to, provide these services that we need? And so I'm hoping people come to that realization sooner rather than later.
Yeah. Well, this next 2 months will be an interesting an important moment to try to make the case for targeting bad behavior and facilitating openness where it makes sense macroeconomically. I think I've heard Vivek Ramaswamy talk about some of this to some extent. I don't know if there's anyone else within the Trump sphere you've seen.
Yeah, I mean, Elon talks about it a little bit as well. Certainly, he's aware of the demographic problem.
That's for
He
sure.
talks
Yeah.
about legal immigration as a positive thing. You know, but whether it's going to be priority for this administration, I'm skeptical. But in the long term for the party, the fact that those two guys are at least, aware that there's a real demographics issue here and a labor market issue is a good thing. And so it's better to have, a partial messenger rather than none at all.
Yeah. Well, it's been great having you on to talk about your work at the Cato Institute on this issue. And you've been a long timer. I think that says a lot. And I hope people will read your reports if they go back to the blog post that relates to this that I did on Substack. They can learn more. I'm going to end with a little vision of sort of the organic nature of hope. Here in Maine, where I live, my son and his girlfriend are filmmakers, and they recently did a 1 minute, 60-second documentary on a lobster woman who's a 7th generation Maine lobster woman. And she's also innovating in scallop farming, and they were on her boat for a couple of days, and the deckhand is Jamaican. Now, I don't know if he's undocumented or documented, but this is just going to sort of play out if there's some openness to the door. And then here in Maine, most of the people replacing roofs are Mexican immigrants. They're families who run around, and they're not displacing anyone as far as anyone can tell. They're providing a key service at a price that makes sense. So I think the more those stories propagate, the more it's possible to cut against the sort of digital disinformation storms that kind of dominate rhetoric and sort of the punditry. So that's my hopeful end to this. They're going to make us a longer film around this, and we'll see how this all plays out, as my dad used to say. So again, thanks so much for being on, David Beer, Cato Institute, and also Paolo Pinotti from I won't say the name of the university in Milan. Anyone can share this now that we're done. Just share the link you're watching on, whether you're on YouTube, LinkedIn, X, or wherever. And we can do more. So thanks again. Have a good day, and keep at it.
Thank you.